There's a family here on Minor Avenue that's living in a house where 11 people were massacred more than 30 years ago.
It was Easter Sunday evening of March 30th, 1975, when the Hamilton Police Department received a chilling phone call reporting a shooting at 635 Minor Avenue, Hamilton, Ohio, USA. As police were making their way towards the scene, a horrifying scene of cruelty was waiting to unfold. Upon arrival, they witnessed a scene that would forever haunt them. A total of 11 lifeless bodies, including children as young as 4, were lying all around the house. But the most shocking part was that the attacker was chillingly sitting there, waiting for the police to arrive. The attacker was identified as 41-year-old James Urban Ruppert, and the people who were attacked weren't strangers to him, it was his own family. And once you find out the reason behind this act of violence, it will leave you in your tracks. James's story began on March 29, 1934, when he was born to his mother Charity and father Leonard. Having one older brother named Leonard Jr., they grew up in Hamilton, Ohio. The Ruppert family was unlike most. In fact, it was a true reflection of a dysfunctional family. The father, Leonard Sr., was known for having a violent temper, which was often unleashed on his 2 children. To put it simply, the 2 children had traumatic lives with their father, who had little to no love for them. Making things harder, the mother, Charity, had created an environment of favoritism and began giving preference to Leonard Jr. over James. She would even go a step ahead and say harsh words to James. For example, she once said that she wished James had never been born because she wanted to have a daughter in his place. The couple was already struggling with poverty and a financial crisis at the time, which further worsened the family situation. Leonard Sr. had turned to alcohol as a way to cope. Since he was already harsh and violent, alcohol made him way more hostile. He would often humiliate James and tell him that he was a failure and wouldn't be able to have a job in the future and live independently. The constant humiliation and absence of parents' affection had turned James into a sickly and awkward child with no confidence. At the age of 2, James had developed bronchial asthma, and therefore he had a lot of difficulty breathing. His symptoms worsened, especially in the damp and cold weather, which was a regular occurrence in Hamilton. For this reason, James would often be confined to his house when other kids ran and played outside. To make everything go downhill, Leonard Sr. began raising chickens in the backyard. James, who was already suffering, became more ill. The dust and the feathers made his asthma worse, but his father didn't care. He would regularly make James clean the chicken coop, which would make James wheeze throughout the night, disrupting his sleep. He would often wake up restless. His parents continued to keep the chickens around the house even when he became allergic to the feathers. Because of the same reason, James's hospital visits were frequent, resulting in his absence from school, making James appear a weak and worthless child. The worst part was that his parents often reminded him of his flaws, which only added to his awkwardness. Because of this, James could never make friends, no matter how hard he tried. While he was already suffering mentally, his illness and poor health had affected his physical appearance as well. The constant coughing and inability to breathe properly had given him a hunch, blocking his normal physical growth. If that wasn't already hard for James, his awkwardness and poor physical appearance made him an easy target for bullies, both in school and in his neighborhood. What made it worse was the constant comparison to his older brother, Leonard Jr., who had everything their parents admired: tall, athletic, social, and academically successful. Leonard Jr. was the kind of person everyone noticed, even the teachers at school. However, the most painstaking part was Charity's constant needling of James. She would push boundaries to make him feel insecure about his own brother, asking him questions like, "Why can't you be like Leonard?" While life was already tough for James, it became even worse after Leonard Sr. died from tuberculosis when James was only 12. With his death, Charity made it clear to James that his elder brother was the man of the house and also his father figure. From that day forward, Leonard Jr. followed in his father's footsteps and began treating James the same way their father had. He would harass and belittle James in every way he could. This ill treatment from Leonard Jr. worsened James's academic performance. Whenever he would return from school with a B grade on his exams or tests, Charity would punish him for being slow and stupid. Reportedly, Charity also began physical abuse towards James after her husband's passing. She would also ask Leonard Jr. to participate in the beating, apparently to make him a better person. At one point, the escalated too far when James threw a dinner plate on the floor. They drugged him and kept him in the basement. What followed was an intense round of beatings. James was so heartbroken and helpless that he attempted to flee his house. He ran away multiple times, only to be returned to the house later every time with more depression. It pushed him to the point where he thought about and attempted to take his own life, but failed to do so. Around the same time, when James was 18, he was diagnosed with spinal meningitis, a severe inflammation of the membranes and fluid around the brain and spinal cord. As a result, James spent more than a few weeks at the hospital and returned with much more weakness and more misery than before, once again thinking about ending his life. With bullying following him everywhere, even inside his own home, James lost all interest in his studies and gave up on trying to improve his life. At the time, Leonard had finished school, joined the military, and received a degree. After this event, Charity began reminding James that he would never be able to get the same degree. After finishing school in 1952, James got into Xavier University to study electrical engineering. James had always been an average student, but his deteriorating health and lack of will to live further dragged his performance down. His grades slipped to B's and C's, and before long he could no longer keep up. After just 2 years, James dropped out and took a well-paying job at General Electric, which finally allowed him to move out of his parents' home. However, even that small step toward independence didn't last long, as he lost the job. James later secured a new temporary job as a draftsman, but this role required him to travel frequently between different locations. When he wasn't traveling, he would be found at two of his favorite places: a library to read the financial section of newspapers, or a bar. By the time he turned 30, his job as a draftsman had ended big time. He returned to the same house and began living in the spare bedroom of his mother's house. After losing this job, he juggled different dead-end jobs and resorted to heavy drinking just like his father. While he continued to visit the library to nurture his passion, he also began to frequent another place quite often. It was target shooting. James had developed an odd passion and love for firearms, which eventually led to a good collection of guns that he would take with him during practice down the river. However, each hobby, including going to the bar, the library, and target shooting, required money, which he didn't have. He often borrowed from his mother and brother, but the loans never lasted long. James quickly wasted the money on alcohol, only to return asking for more. This cycle repeated itself, and with every request his resentment grew deeper, yet the begging didn't stop. In James's mind, it was his mother and brother who had pushed him into this miserable situation. And as if to humiliate him further, Leonard Jr. managed to surpass James even in matters of love. When James was in his 20s, he met a woman named Alma, someone with whom he had thought about spending his whole life. Alma was warm, loving, and kind, the exact opposite of James's mother, who was cruel and hostile towards him. James and Alma began spending a lot of time together. However, it wasn't always just the two of them. Leonard Jr. would often join their outings and spend time with them as well. For James, it was only Alma that could make his life better and fulfilling, but the same couldn't be said about Alma herself. She hadn't made any promises to James about spending her life with him. In fact, she was unsure and stuck between choosing between James and Leonard Jr. as her life partner. Eventually, Leonard Jr. forced the situation by giving Alma an ultimatum. She had to choose between the two brothers. Unsurprisingly, Alma chose Leonard, the taller, more successful, and socially admired sibling, leaving James with nothing but rejection. Standing at only 5 feet 6 inches, and with no real success to his name, James felt overshadowed in every way. What cut the deepest was that it wasn't just Alma slipping away, it was his own brother taking her from him. Within months, Leonard and Alma announced their engagement, and to make matters even more humiliating, Leonard asked James to stand beside him as his best man. Leonard and Alma finally got married and moved on with their lives, leaving James behind. But James couldn't let go of his past. His grudge against Leonard built over time and grew into something horrible. The bitterness deepened with every passing year, especially when the couple announced the arrival of their new child. The news would appear like a knife striking his chest. Little by little, the couple welcomed another child. With each birth, their bond became stronger, but James's heart kept shattering piece by piece until it was completely crumbled. When such a thing occurred, James had lost it all, including his sanity. It was March 30th, 1975, when Charity returned from celebrating Mass at the local parish. She was busy preparing meals in the kitchen for her elder son and daughter-in-law and their 8 children, who were about to join her for dinner that day. At around 4 p.m., the couple and the children arrived at the house, where Charity had arranged an Easter egg hunt for the kids. When the children finished the fun activity, they had dinner, all while listening to the bells ring across the town, announcing the end of the holiday Mass. The entire family was there, but one person was missing: James. He had just turned 41 the day before, and at the time of dinner he was sleeping in his room. But as the family took their last bites, James suddenly appeared in the dining room. There was nothing ordinary about his arrival. His face was expressionless, cold, and in his hands he carried 2 loaded handguns and a rifle. At around 9:30 p.m. that day, the Hamilton Police Department received a report of a shooting at Ruppert's house. When they arrived at the house, the police officers found James at the front door. They noticed that James was in clean clothes and looked fresh. Upon inquiry, he told them calmly that someone had been shot in the house. After a brief round of questions, the officers decided to move inside. But before going inside, one of them asked James if anyone was injured and needed help. In response, James calmly claimed that nobody was alive. What awaited them inside was a nightmare they would never forget. The dining room, which was full of laughter and chaos, was dead silent. Everything, apart from the high-rise furniture, was stained with red, including the walls, dining table, sofa, chairs, and floors. 11 lifeless lay scattered throughout the house, including James's mother, his brother, his sister-in-law, and 8 young nieces and nephews. One thing that stopped the officer in his tracks was the multiple firearms sitting on the dining table. Before stepping out to the front door, the officer took a final look at the grim scene, then turned to James with a direct question. Was there another perpetrator they needed to look for? James simply shook his head. It was clear that the house had only one living person at the time, who was James, and officers had to take him in custody, not just as a witness, but as their prime suspect. When he was brought to the police station, the officers read him the Miranda rights and asked him if he needed a lawyer to challenge the suspicion. But James rejected their offer, claiming he didn't need one. Instead, he appeared calm and cooperative towards the officers, especially during the first few minutes of questioning. When the officers asked about the firearms on the dining table, James calmly admitted that those guns belonged to him. He also told them his whole routine for that day, claiming that he hadn't stepped out of the house that day but had gone out for drinking the night before. James's calm demeanor and cooperation didn't last long. He began showing the signs of agitation as soon as he struggled to remember the names of his nieces and nephews. In a moment of confusion and panic, he straight up asked to get him a lawyer. The officers recommended one lawyer to him, whom he called and made a beyond shocking claim. He insisted that he was a suspect in a The officers were taken aback by how smoothly and calmly he twisted the truth, as if the 11 family members could be reduced to just one. After calling different lawyers, James eventually secured one. Meanwhile, some of the officers made it back to the crime scene to look for the evidence that could link James to the homicides directly. At first glance, nothing seemed to connect him directly, but 3 details stood out. 1, James hadn't stepped out of the house, which meant he was there at the time of the incident. 2. He had claimed possession of the firearm sitting on the dining table. 3. There was a big red spot on his shoes. Still, James hadn't accepted that he was the actual perpetrator, but all 3 details were enough to name him the prime suspect. The authorities also couldn't just let him slide, as it was a high-profile multiple homicide case. Therefore, he was arrested on the spot and led away in handcuffs. James was charged with 11 counts of aggravated murder. His role as the actual perpetrator was proved right after the forensic results were out, confirming James's fingerprints on the firearms and ammunition used in the incident. Following a few days, a grand jury indicted James on 11 counts of murder, insisting that the homicides were pre-planned. This meant that James could get the penalty, which was at the time carried out by an electric chair. But before anything could happen, the prosecutor received a call from James's lawyer, who claimed that James was highly depressed, paranoid, and idle. The lawyer insisted on having James under 24-hour surveillance to ensure his safety while being in custody. But that wasn't everything. The lawyer also claimed that a renowned psychiatrist and a professor at the University of Pennsylvania named Dr. Mechanic had performed a mental health assessment on James. He said that James was being provoked by his brother over the years before the incident eventually happened, implying that he was grossly psychotic and struggled with the persecution complex and paranoia. The prosecutor then met with the psychiatrist personally, who claimed that James was insane and unfit to stand trial. But of course, the prosecutors couldn't just accept what was thrown their way by the defense team. They had 2 options to choose from. 1. Consider James insane and unfit for a trial, or 2nd, pursue him for. The prosecutors decided to take James to court. The defense team responded strategically, entering both not guilty and guilty pleas, arguing that if James was guilty, it was only because of his insanity. In other words, he wasn't truly responsible for the homicide. The judge ordered James's 30-day psychiatric evaluation and kept him in custody without bond. When he returned to the court almost a month later, the court heard his evaluation and made a decision based on it. A total of 4 experts shared their testimonies about his condition. First, one stated he was in a paranoid psychotic state, possibly from brain damage. Second, said he had a paranoid personality, but still fit for trial. Third, stated that he had a paranoid personality with schizoid traits. Fourth, paranoid psychosis, feelings of persecution, and distorted reality.
We have no way of telling the court what Mr. Ruppert's ability to rationally discuss the case with his attorneys, to rationally assist in the preparation of a defense would be if he were not under the effect of either a major tranquilizer such as Thorazine or Trilofan at this time. Isn't that right?
All of which meant he could easily stand a trial. The court noted that James' mental illness was not equal to insanity. James then waived his right to a jury and chose instead to be tried by a 3-judge panel. His trial began on June 16, 1975. In the opening statements, the prosecution laid out all the evidence against James, including the crime scene photos, fingerprint evidence, and the guns found at the crime scene. The prosecutors also presented testimonies from psychiatrists, colleagues of James, and other witnesses, such as the gun dealers. Piece by piece, they built the picture of a man who had ended his family's lives for financial gain. His brother and sister-in-law had more than enough funds in their savings, and then there was the staggering insurance money of around $300,000. By contrast, James's own finances were crumbling. He had only $2,600 in assets and owed his mother and brother about $4,500 in loans. In the eyes of the state, the motive was clear. Greed, fueled by resentment, had driven James Ruppert to commit the crime.
His family to collect his brother's $300,000 or so in life insurance. That's what I think. It's what I think the evidence showed, and that's what I believe.
The defense, however, painted a very different picture. Many psychologists came to the stand to give testimonies. One of them said his ego was just completely overwhelmed by his rage. This suppressed rage he'd been accumulating over 10 years or more, actually, since childhood. After hearing multiple witnesses and arguments from both sides, the court reached a verdict. James was found guilty of 11 counts of aggravated murder. The decision was based on a 2-to-1 ratio, which meant that 2 of the 3 judges agreed with the decision to find James guilty. James was sentenced to 11 life terms, but the case was far from over. In 1982, James appeared in court once again for a second trial, as Ohio's First District Court of Appeals had overturned James's conviction because he had not been given proper advice about waiving his right to a jury trial. However, he couldn't do much this time either. There was a lot of evidence against him, but his defense team couldn't bring any proof that he was insane or innocent. As a result, he was found guilty of the murders of his brother and mother, but was found not guilty by reason of insanity for the murder of Alma and the 8 children. James was given 2 life sentences for being guilty of 2 counts of murder. Since then, he never got to step out of jail until he died in June of 2022 due to natural causes at the age of 88. It was 3 years before he was set to appear in court for a parole hearing in April 2025. The case serves as a grim reminder that jealousy, resentment, and years of quiet anger can explode in the most horrific way possible. What do you think? Could this act of brutality have been prevented in the first place if someone had noticed the warning signs, or was James destined to explode like that? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel for more chilling true crime documentaries.